Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Hello, everybody. Thank you all for joining this morning. My name is Moises Rendon. I'm the Director of the Future of Venezuela Initiative and Fellow of the Americas Program at CSIS. Before we begin, I would like to invite you to submit questions to our panelists using the Ask Live Questions button on the event page. Yesterday, the Maduro regime hosted National Assembly elections that lacked many conditions of electoral integrity. In the months leading up to the election, the regime took over major opposition parties and blocked several opposition candidates from running. Given the humanitarian and security situation in the country, voters were at risk of being threatened or exploited at the polls. As such, the opposition chose not to participate. Poll centers across the country were remarkably empty yesterday, with turnout estimated at just 30% of eligible voters. The US, Canada, the European Union, and Latin American countries of the Lima Group have already stated that they are not recognizing these elections and they're calling these elections as illegitimate. But as expected, the Maduro regime has claimed victory in these elections. The new illegitimately elected assembly will be sworn in on January 5th, complicating the legal status of the Venezuelan interim government. In the days and months to come, the international community will have important decisions to make, including a couple of them, like states will decide whether and how to uphold the legitimacy of the Venezuelan interim government, which derives its constitutional authority from the current National Assembly. States will also decide whether and how to continue recognizing the 2015 and 2020 National Assembly, which could have its mandate extended if there's no legitimately elected assembly to take its place. We're gonna dive deeper into this issue later on. These decisions will impact the interim government ability to safeguard external assets, protect Venezuelan resources, oversee humanitarian assistance, denounce human rights violations, and facilitate a peaceful democratic transition. We hope that these events serve as an opportunity, right, and a space to shed light on the legal and political implications of yesterday's elections and discuss what is the international community's support for the Venezuelan interim government and the National Assembly will look like after January 5th. For that, we have an excellent panel. I'm very grateful for each of them to have time to join us today. We have Carrie Filippetti. She's the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Cuba and Venezuela at the U.S. State Department Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs. She started her position the same day that the interim president, Juan Guaido, was recognized as such by the international community. Carrie previously served as Senior Policy Advisor for the United States mission to the UN. Michael Grant is the Assistant Deputy Minister for the Americas at Global Affairs Canada. Ambassador Grant previously served as Canadian Ambassador, a Deputy Permanent Representative to the UN. He has also been a Canadian Ambassador to Libya and served as a Canadian embassies in Turkey, Argentina, Israel, and Mexico. Thank you, Ambassador, for joining. And then last but not least, we have Jose Ignacio Hernandez. He's the former Special Attorney General for the Venezuelan interim government. He's now currently a fellow at Harvard University Grove Lab. Mr. Hernandez has taught administrative law at the Universidad Central de Venezuela, and of course, in the best university of Venezuela, my alma mater, Universidad Católica Andrés Bello. Thank you, Jose Ignacio, for joining us as well. So let's start asking Jose Ignacio, from your electoral and legal point of view, can you discuss why these elections that took place yesterday in December 6th are considered both illegitimate and fraudulent?
Well, good morning. Thank you so much, CSIS, for the invitation to be here. Moises, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with Carrie and Michael talking about the Venezuelan situation. Yesterday, elections were the less competitive process ever held in Venezuela since 1958. Resuming the analysis of the electoral integrity conditions of the 2018 presidential elections conducted by the Electoral Integrity Project, which was the last international project that analyzed electoral integrity conditions in Venezuela, it is possible to conclude that there are three main violations of these parliamentary elections that were held yesterday. First, the lack of an independent electoral authority due to the usurpation of power of the National Assembly by the Supreme Tribunal that appointed the 5 directors of the National Electoral Council. Second, the arbitrary modification of the electoral laws by the National Electoral Council that changed the number of deputies, changed the election procedures, and more importantly, suppressed the direct vote of the indigenous communities, which is a gross violation not only of the Venezuelan Constitution, but also about the international human rights law. Finally, the intervention of the 3 main political parties by the Supreme Tribunal created a co-opted opposition. And this is, in my opinion, the most important violation and the element that helps to differentiate this parliamentary election from other processes. Until now, Maduro's strategy was aimed to block the participation of the free and democratic opposition. In this election, Maduro moved a step forward and decided to create an opposition, which is known in the electoral integrity conditions as the co-opted opposition. As a result, the reduced space of electoral competitiveness was destroyed. Additionally, as concluded by the Human Rights Council and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, these rigged elections aggravated the systematic violation of human rights based on political reasons. Consequently, and based on Article 25 and 138 of the Venezuelan Constitution, the outcome of these elections should be deemed null, void, and inexistent.
Thank you, Jose Ignacio. Kerry, what is the U.S. response so far on these elections? And Michael, I'm going to come to you too. And what is the Canada's position on the elections that took place yesterday? I understand Canada Foreign Minister released a statement yesterday that's saying that it's not recognizing the elections, but give us your take as well. So Kerry, over to you.
Sure, thanks, Moises, and great to see you as well, and great to see Jose and Michael on the line. I think in response to what is the United States' view of this election, the easiest answer is what election, right? So any election requires, in a democracy, any election requires a key thing, which is the demos, right? It requires the people. And when you think about where are the people, well, 6 million of them have fled Venezuela. Tens of thousands of them have been tortured or harassed into silence. Millions of them have been silenced by censorship. Hundreds of them are in political prisons. And even those who had the ability to go out and vote and participate in this supposed election chose not to. I mean, the statistics that we're seeing, even the regime, which has hyperinflated the numbers, is saying only 31% of people went out to vote. Now, the most likely numbers are actually much lower than that, somewhere in the 20%. And so, is this, what is the response to this election? Is that there wasn't an election. And so there's nothing that really changes. This is a continuation from the 2018 fraud, where Maduro announced himself president despite no conditions being in existence for free and fair elections then. As Jose Ignacio just mentioned, we also are seeing that this is the most repressive electoral conditions in Venezuelan history since 1958. That's fairly significant considering the amount of violations that we saw even in May 2018. So our secretary recently released a statement, also joining Canada, the Lima Group, the European Union, essentially saying that this election changes nothing. It was not free and fair. It did not meet the minimum conditions, and not only meet the minimum conditions the day of the election, but well in advance, we were seeing initiatives being undertaken to undermine democratic support. So truthfully, we will continue along the same policy that we have had, and we respect and appreciate the fact that we have seen dozens of countries really come forward and acknowledge that this fraud is not going to change anything on the ground.
Thank you, Kerry. Michael, anything on Canada's position on this?
Yeah, thanks, Moises, and good to see you, Carrie and Jose Ignacio. Look, I don't want to just take up airtime in repeating, because what Carrie said is exactly the same position as Canada. We were not surprised of what happened, because we saw it coming, not just in the last few weeks, but over the last few years. Jose Ignacio quite eloquently presented the legal reasons, and it's very important for us to hear that and understand that. But it was pretty clear, not even close to the minimum conditions were existent for this event to take place. I like the way Carrie has put that it's tough to even label them elections, because they weren't. And it's really great to see the real solidarity. There's statements from the EU, from the US, from the Lima Group, a number of individual countries. And I think this is a very important moment when you look at that solidarity, because we are going to have to work together going forward. But in terms of our position, it's pretty clear this was a very simple and straightforward decision.
Thank you, Michael. Jose Ignacio, one of the issues that we're going to have to face now is the interim government's legal status moving forward. No, as our audience, just to remind our audience, the interim government derives its constitutional legitimacy from the 2015 to 2020 National Assembly. So how will these elections influence the interim government's legal status and representation abroad after January 5th, which is the end of the mandate term of the current National Assembly?
A great question. Just the elections cannot affect the legitimacy of the National Assembly elected in 2015, because, as I explained, its outcome is null, void, and inexistent. Therefore, a de facto procedure, as happened with yesterday's elections, cannot affect a de jure legitimacy of the National Assembly. The deputies elected yesterday will be as illegitimate as the deputies of the National Constituent Assembly. Therefore, from the international law perspective, the relevant argument is the repudiation of Maduro's deputies as a legitimate representative of the National Assembly, as already was announced, among others, by United States, Canada, the Lima Group, and the European Union. From a tactical perspective, and based on the Venezuelan constitutional law, this is a very peculiar situation. I need to clarify that what I'm going to explain is my position as a law scholar, do not reflect necessarily the political position of the interim government. And how can we solve from the constitutional law perspective this unique situation? The answer was already provided, among others, by the law school of the Central University of Venezuela. Because the election held yesterday is an illegitimate process that does not produce any legal and binding consequences, the mandate of the 2015 deputies should be preserved until valid, free, and fair elections are held. This is, by the way, a general principle in the Venezuelan constitutional law established by a ruling of the Supreme Tribunal dated June 17, 2005. In absence of an election, the elected officials should preserve their post until elections are held. This was the same solution that was applied in 3 cases in Venezuela, 2009, 2016, and 2017. This is nothing new. Which is new, the uncommon situation, of course, is the total breakdown of the constitutional order in Venezuela and the difficulties to establish a constitutional solution. But to sum up, the relevant conclusion today, I think, is the illegitimacy of yesterday's election, which cannot have any binding effect and cannot improve the international legitimacy of Maduro regime, which is and will be a de facto and predatory regime responsible for gross human rights violations.
Thank you, Jose. Look, that's an important point, and this is a purely legal, but also international law perspective of the implications. We're gonna dive deeper into the reality on the ground, right? At the end of the day, Maduro is gonna impose a new National Assembly, and we're gonna discuss what the policy implications are on that, because Maduro is certainly consolidating a dictatorship now that there's no longer a democratic institution in the country. So let's dive deeper in that next. But before Carrie and Michael, there has been some unprecedented times when it comes to policy towards Venezuela in the last 2 years. We have now a recognized interim government by more than 50 states. But now we have this new challenge, which is also unprecedented. So I'm curious to hear what is Canada's and also the US preparation to respond to the end of the constitutional mandated term of the sitting National Assembly on January 5th. And will Canada / the US continue supporting the current National Assembly?
Yeah. Would you like me to go, Moises?
Sure, Michael, go ahead.
So thank you very much. I think, the first way I'll answer that question is that the analysis provided by Jose Ignacio is so valuable for us because it actually shows a pretty clear path. And yes, the situation in Venezuela is quite unique. There have been unique steps taken over the last couple of years, but from where we sit, it seems quite straightforward in terms of what is illegitimate and what is legitimate. Moving forward, we really want to work within the Lima Group with our international partners to see how we can keep this solidarity going forward. From a Canadian perspective, we only have one option, that is continue to support those who believe in democracy, believe in human rights, and believe that all Venezuelans should enjoy those. And so that's how we'll be looking at things in the coming weeks and beyond.
I would just add, and now it's my turn to just, reiterate what Michael said, because it's very consistent with the United States position. I would just maybe change the wording of your question a little bit, because based on what Jose Ignacio has said, there really isn't the end of the constitutionally mandated period for the National Assembly, because we haven't seen free and fair elections in the same way that we never saw free and fair elections for president. And so I think the question really is, are we going to continue to recognize the National Assembly that was elected in 2015 until there's a free and fair parliamentary election? And that has been our policy for the presidential election as well. We are going to make sure that we are getting to a free, fair, and truly democratic election. So the answer is yes, we will definitely continue to recognize the current National Assembly. Many international countries have highlighted that they did not recognize the Constituent Assembly. This new election is just replacing the Constituent Assembly with something else. It's the same basic premise, right? It's just a sort of shadow National Assembly that tries to make it look like there's some semblance of democracy in the country when there really isn't. It does highlight, and part of the reason why I really appreciate that Jose Ignacio is here, it highlights that US policy, Venezuelan policy, Canadian policy, Lima Group policy, European Union policy has all been predicated on one key thing from the get-go, and that is the supremacy and sovereignty of the Venezuelan Constitution. That is the thing upon which we will always determine our policy when it comes to who we are recognizing and when inside Venezuela, whether it's a parliament or a president. And I think it's really important that the interim government is also focusing all of their arguments on the supremacy of the Constitution. That is the basis of Venezuelan democracy. That is also why I know that the interim government is so focused on rejuvenating and revitalizing the domestic pressure inside the country, highlighted through the consulta, to really show the people of Venezuela that their voices can be heard. It is going to be a process, but we are all continuing the fight. And that's not going to end just because of these fraudulent elections of yesterday.
Thank you, Carrie. Let me just follow up on that, because I think you brought up very important points. So we have the Lima Group, which Michael, and Canada is part of that important group. We have the contact group in Europe, and we have other more independent like countries around the region and the world. So my question, I guess, would be, how can we ensure that the international community maintains a unified voice in the international community, especially post January 5th? Because again, not every country, they're debating what to do, and they're revising their policy and their precedents and their history. And you know, some of them have links to the Maduro regime, either through businesses or through, you know, some sort of investment in the country. So from a policy perspective, I'm curious to hear your views and Michael's views on how can we ensure a more unified voice and platform from the international community moving forward.
Sure. Well, I'll start. I mean, obviously, this has been a real multilateral effort from the get-go. I mean, the Lima Group is really the institution that started the broader international policy when it comes to supporting free and fair elections and a return to democracy in Venezuela. And that multilateralism has really carried through. We have seen the Lima Group, we've seen the ICG, we've seen the EU, all focus an intense amount of attention on the crisis in Venezuela. Part of maintaining international unity is really helping people to understand that what begins as a human rights crisis in one country necessarily ultimately becomes an issue of regional insecurity or even international instability. I mean, you mentioned that I previously worked at the United States mission to the United Nations, and this was Ambassador Haley's main message, particularly when it came to countries like Venezuela. Back in 2017, before the May 2018 fraudulent presidential election, she really highlighted that there were human rights violations going on, ones that we now know actually could have constituted crimes against humanity. And she warned the United Nations that if we did not pay attention to it, if we did not ensure accountability, that it would ultimately turn into an issue of international instability. And unfortunately, that's exactly what we've seen. We have been highlighting the fact that this is internationally destabilizing. And that's been really useful in our diplomatic engagement because countries realize that it's critically important that we preserve the sort of domestic desire for freedom and democracy in the country, because it will start affecting Chile, Ecuador, Peru, Colombia, Brazil. It affects the United States. It affects the European Union. You know, what's happening in Venezuela is an issue of global concern. So one piece is just making sure that we're reiterating that. The second piece is to make sure that we're using existing multilateral institutions, whether that's the United Nations, whether that's the OAS, which continuously has really strong resolutions about Venezuela, pointing out the regional perspective, or whether it's the TR resolutions, which really ensure accountability. Talking with one voice, speaking with one voice, as many countries did on this election, is important to show the Maduro regime that they are not going to get away with what they're trying to do, and there's no easy way out of this. Finally, I would just point out that the last piece of maintaining international unity is for us to find a pathway towards some kind of accountability. What I mean by that is we have seen how the fact-finding mission highlighted potential crimes against humanity. We have seen reports that indicate tens of thousands of instances of torture and extrajudicial killings. We have seen cases raised in the ICC. We have seen indictments raised by the United States. And I think it's really time that we deploy the multilateral mechanisms that we have to bring people to justice, because doing so will ensure that the Maduro regime understands that it needs to change its behavior and engage in a good faith negotiation, or else things are not going to end well for them and their insiders.
If I can add, Moises, just a few comments. I think you asked how can the international community work together? Well, I think you're seeing a really good example of it, you know, today. You know, it's not a coincidence that we've had such strong statements that have consistent messages. There's been a lot of work over the last few weeks and a lot of discussions that needs to continue. You know, we all agree on some, well, pretty much all the fundamental points. We agree that Venezuelans deserve democracy and human rights. We agree that there needs to be accountability. We agree that there needs to be a peaceful transition back to democracy. And I think focusing on those elements is how the international community is going to work together better. You know, there's always been a little bit of, I guess you could say, natural tension between the groupings. You know, it's a bit politics in a way, and that's fine. There's nothing really wrong with it. I do think personally, my own view is I think we should be working in almost a post-group kind of fashion. I agree with Carrie that the Lima Group has had an essential role from the beginning. That's going to continue. But there needs to be creative ways to look beyond that. And what I'm seeing is a tremendous amount of goodwill wherever you are to do just that. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael and Carrie. Jose Ignacio, as we speak, I'm hearing already comments from the international community, and I want to ask you, there's an ongoing debate on how to respond to this beyond the countries that we have mentioned. So I want to ask you, what are the international, not domestic? We hear you. I have the Constitution here, by the way. I now with these issues, I'm trying to revise everything that I learned from my law school, which is pretty clear. I don't think from a domestic point of view, there's any doubts that what you just said, but from the international point of view, it's a little bit more complicated. So I want to ask you, what are the international legal arguments for the international multilateral system to continue supporting the current National Assembly and therefore the interim government led right now by Juan Guaido?
Well, basically, are the same arguments that have been sustained by the international community, United States, European Union, Lima Group, International Contact Group, Organization of American States since 2018. In Venezuela, the electoral integrity conditions have been dismantled by Maduro's regime, who is using the electoral process to advance in gross and systematic human rights violations. Unfortunately, as Carrie and Michael explained, we already had today several statements from the United States government, the Canada government, the Lima Group, the European Union that ratify the same principles. So as for today, under the international law, Maduro is not recognized as a legitimate government of Venezuela. He is recognized as a de facto and authoritarian ruler responsible of human rights violations, and therefore the deputies that will be proclaimed as such by Maduro's regime in the next day will not be considered the legitimate representative of the National Assembly. And this is a very solid ground to advance in strategy that, in my opinion, should be focused not only in the political dimension of the complex transition in Venezuela, but more importantly, in the humanitarian perspective of the complex transition in Venezuela. Because the main question here is how to prevent from the international law the systematic violation of human rights. And a key element, a key tactic to prevent gross human rights violations is to deny the international legitimacy of Nicolás Maduro as Venezuelan government, because this will prevent Maduro to use assets that otherwise will be deviated to kleptocracy and to finance gross human rights violations. Those are solid principles under the international law perspective that can be used to build a strategy for the, particularly as for January the 5th, 2021, when this new and de facto National Assembly will take power of the legislative palace that is currently occupied by the illegitimate National Constituent Assembly.
And let me just follow, Jose Ignacio. And what happens? So why might these international efforts be impacted? And if we see the interim government moving in exile now, and I want to clarify a couple of things. Like, my understanding, most of the members of the interim government are already living abroad. I think one of the few that stay, that is behind, that's still on the ground is, well, President Guaido himself, and the core of his team, but most of the members are abroad. So how this may impact, Jose Ignacio, and I want to hear from Carrie and Michael too, like the possibility of having more people from the opposition and interim government operating in exile, and potentially the current National Assembly as well.
Well, strictly from the perspective of the international law, this will have no effect at all. As has been explained by scholars of international law, and by the way, affirmed by several rulings of district courts here in the United States, a government in the exile is a legitimate government that has been forced to move into the exile, but the legitimacy is not hindered under the perspective of international law due to this exile situation. The main problem is not, in my opinion, from a legal one, as you explained, Moises. Part of the interim government are in the exile. I was a special attorney general for almost 2 years in the exile, and this never hindered my authority. But from a political dimension, the most important issue to recall is that political transition will require domestic pressure. And in that sense, a government in the exile, or more precisely, an opposition in the exile, could have detrimental impacts.
Thank you. Anything to add there, Carrie or Michael? How a government in exile may impact your policy or your views?
I can jump in quickly. I mean, so first of all, I think this is where, going back to some of Michael's earlier points, where the international community is so important. Because I do think that it's important to have, as Jose Ignacio mentioned, an opposition within the country that is fighting and increasing internal pressure. Absolutely. I also know that the Maduro regime is most likely going to remove the immunities of deputies following January 5th and begin a campaign of harassment and intimidation and arbitrary arrests, as they do. They've done it not only against deputies, they do it against humanitarian actors. They do it against aid workers. They do it against individual citizens for just sharing their point of view. So we're almost certain that they will try to do that. And it's incumbent on the international community to, once again, ensure accountability and ensure that there's a consequence for that so that the Maduro regime doesn't undertake that as part of its calculus. Now, that being said, I also agree with Jose Ignacio that even if the Maduro regime were to successfully get Venezuelan opposition leaders to go into exile, you can't get the entire country to go into exile. And when you look at who supports Nicolas Maduro, the numbers are obscenely small. So if Maduro thinks that by getting rid of a handful of deputies and sending them abroad, that that's going to fundamentally affect his ability to remain in power, it won't, because frankly, at a certain point, it's the final straw. And we're starting to see how the Venezuelan people are once again beginning to protest, once again going out and sharing their voice, once again participating in this consulta. And so that sort of message is critically important because it demonstrates to Maduro that if he got rid of a few deputies, you still have to deal with the millions of Venezuelans inside the country who are going to fight against you, because the legacy of Venezuela is the country that brought democracy to the rest of the region. And they're not going to stop that fight. So I don't think in the long run it has a significant impact, but I do think it's critically important that the international community prevent Maduro, or do what we can to prevent Maduro from going down this path, because I do think we want to have as many of those folks there connecting with the people as possible.
The only thing I would add is, well, to answer your question, look, this isn't going to impact how we see legitimacy or illegitimacy. We are very concerned about the personal safety of President Guaido and his interim government, and that certainly is something that they will be taking on board. And to Carrie's point, absolutely right. This has to be a key element of the work of the international community going forward, is to make it clear that, abuses of human rights, political persecution, et cetera, is not going to go unnoticed. And, our two countries and others have put in place a number of sanctions. This is something that we're actively looking at again. And we encourage others to do it, because we do believe in a peaceful transition. This is the only way that this has to happen. But we also believe that those who are accountable for these things need to be held accountable, and the international community can and should put pressure, and that's what we intend to do.
Michael, let me ask you. Yeah, go ahead, Carrie.
Sorry, I just wanted to add something, because as I'm thinking about what transpired yesterday, and going back to my point about how he would have to exile essentially the entire country in order to change things for him. I mean, think about what the Maduro regime was doing yesterday. Diosdado Cabello was warning people that if they didn't go to the voting booths, that they wouldn't receive food from the CLAP program. He was warning them that if they didn't go to vote, that they would lose their jobs. He had set up individuals who were supporting regime propaganda and threatening people to vote for Chavista candidates. Despite all of those efforts, despite all of those political manipulations, which frankly have worked in the past, you still saw only 20-something% of the population go out to vote out of fear. And so I think that's really significant. And it shows that the people of Venezuela, once again, are increasing their fight as opposed to decreasing it. I think a move against the deputies would not only be problematic from the international community's perspective, but I think you would start to see a lot of these Venezuelans inside the country begin to exert their protesting much more forcefully if they were to see that a lot of their politicians who they elected to be their representatives were being forced out of the country.
Thank you, Kerry. I'm getting a lot of questions from our audience, and I want to encourage them to keep sending questions. We're getting all of them and reading all of them. But one of the questions stands out, and I think is timely given the topic that we're discussing right now. And it says the following: these elections exposed some rift in the Venezuelan opposition, which has historically struggled to stay unified. Is there anything the international community can do to help the Venezuelan opposition maintain unity? So I'm gonna start, either Kerry or Michael, go ahead, and I wanna hear Jose Ignacio's 2 minutes take on it.
Yeah, I don't mind jumping in. Look, in a healthy democracy, differences of political opinion are normal and cherished and expected. So, and the opposition, another label I'm not all that fond of, over the years has demonstrated that it's extremely healthy and it has different points of view. It's not a monolith. And it wouldn't be surprising that going through what is a critical period in the history of Venezuela, that there would be differences of opinions. But I, in my view, from where I sit, there is still very strong unity amongst those political actors who believe in democracy and human rights, and that there needs to be a transition back to it so Venezuelans can enjoy it. I think what we can do is what we have been doing, is that demonstrating what the international community will not stand for, and we've done so in spades in the last 24 hours, and I think you're going to see more of it in a very unified way. We should continue to expect a variety of opinions from all political actors, and again, that should be cherished. I think the leadership needs to do what they've been doing, is take those on board and move forward.
I would just add, when we think about divisions, and I agree fully, by the way, with Michael, I think what we fail to realize is this is a democratic movement. They're fighting for democracy. They're going to experience democracy themselves. If I don't think any American agrees 100% of the time with their party, 100% of the time with their coalition. I mean, I think this is something that is very important in a healthy democracy. And frankly, we should be encouraging the different views that are going on in the country. The biggest thing is, are they united in the end goal, which is a free and fair presidential election and the removal of Nicolas Maduro? And the answer, as proven yesterday and as proven by this consultative process, is absolutely yes. One of the things that we don't talk about as much, because it's maybe not as sexy, is what about the divisions in the regime? We're always talking about the opposition because we get to talk to them and we get to hear their different perspectives and they're open with us. But when you think about what the regime has been doing, they haven't just been fighting against the opposition, the traditional opposition. You've seen them start to go after high-profile chavistas. You've seen them start to go after left-wing political parties. You have seen some serious fracturing, not only within the Maduro regime's inner circle, but within the PSUV as a whole. So when you look at what happened, this just yesterday, you're talking about something like 70 to 80% of the country being divided against Maduro, knowing that these are fraudulent elections, and being really in favor of recognizing that we're not going to participate in this because this is a fraud. And we as Venezuelans believe strongly in our heritage of fighting for democracy. So I do think it's really important that we continue our conversations with the Venezuelans, with the opposition, and make sure that they're continuing on their goal, but they always have been. They're united in their strategy. They disagree on the tactics sometimes because they want to make sure that they're doing the right thing. And I think that can be said of any healthy democracy. So it's important for us to focus on the regime opposition, the regime failures that we've seen over the last couple of months and frankly years, because I think that's going to be more telling to when we can get a successful negotiation than anything else.
Thank you, Kerry. Those are good points. Jose Ignacio, let me ask you the same question, slightly different. I saw from that analysis this morning something around the lines of about 70% of Venezuelans did not show up on the voting yesterday, not because they were supporting the opposition, simply because they were frustrated and they didn't see anything on the table to have a benefit to their lives in their day-to-day struggle. So Venezuelans call this group NINIs, like ni opposition and ni gobierno. So how this group now interact within the current political dynamic from your point of view?
That's a great question. I will say that the binding constraint for a successful negotiation in Venezuela can be summarized in a word: distrust. I agree with you that the turnout of yesterday's election do not necessarily demonstrate an active decision of the Venezuelan people, but just the general distrust toward the electoral system. And this can explain the increased number of ninis. This is a fact, and based on this fact, it is necessary to redesign the tactics to promote a transition in Venezuela based, again, in the humanitarian perspective. And there is plenty of opportunities, because yesterday was a big failure for Maduro's regime. He tried to do this fraud to create the illusion of a popular support. He failed on this. He tried to do these fraudulent elections, hoping to regain the international recognition. He failed on this. And the fact that just 31% of the Venezuelan people decided to vote, despite the pressure, is a clear indication that the Venezuelan people has, regrettably, distrust towards the electoral system, but also is a clear demonstration of the failure of Nicolás Maduro's strategy. And again, this is an asset that should be used to redesign the tactics to promote a complex transition in Venezuela.
Thank you all. Already, I think we can now shift gears a little bit on our policy moving forward. In terms of the Maduro regime consolidating more power and more time after January 5th. As I mentioned earlier, the National Assembly was the last remaining democratic elected institution in the country. And after January 5th, at least from the facto on the ground perspective, there will be a new National Assembly. The Maduro regime will use that National Assembly to their own interest, to the Maduro regime interest. And I'm gonna see a more conflict environment in the country. So that drives me to ask you all, now that we see this consolidation of power and dictatorship on the ground, how our policy, US, Canada, the Lima Group policy, should be adjusted accordingly, given the fact that, again, it's coming. January 5th is coming, and we like it or not, the Maduro regime will have a new National Assembly on the ground. So how is that going to impact all of our policies moving forward? And we can start with Michael, if you want to go. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Moises. Look, I don't know if you're gonna like my answer or not, because I think it's gonna sound a lot like what you've heard already. We need to continue supporting those democratic forces, and to demonstrate to those who decide to carry out human rights abuses and persecution that they will face the international community. On that, I think something that the international community can do more of, or take a harder look at, is the revenues that the Maduro regime are gaining from illicit activities. This is something that we're certainly doing when it comes to illegal gold, and there's many others as well. So I think that could be one additional response. Not that we haven't been already, but I think we can step up our efforts. But really, it's a continuation of the strong support for those actors who believe in democracy and human rights.
I would just add, this isn't our policy because it's easy. This is our policy because it's right. It's the right thing to be doing. It's the right thing to be supporting a country whose people wants to exercise the right to vote against a dictatorship who manipulates humanitarian assistance and commits crimes against humanity, and really uses the institutions of the country that were established to protect and preserve the rights of the people in order to protect and preserve his own financial income. So we are absolutely going to, as Michael said, continue our policy. I think there are, as Michael also said, different shifts that we will need to consider in terms of, I've been mentioning this a lot today, the idea of accountability. I really do feel like the international system has somewhat failed us in this case, because we have these wonderful bodies that are there in order to ensure that something like what's going on in Venezuela doesn't happen anywhere. And so that hasn't been successful in ensuring accountability over the last few years. And so that's something that we're working on as well. As Michael said, looking at where the regime has shifted its financial flows, US sanctions have really helped combat the flows of income from petroleum, from the oil industry in general. And so they turn towards gold and they turn towards other avenues. And so it's critical that we not only cut those off, but we also hold those countries responsible who are buying Venezuelan gold, who are involved in those practices, because the accountability can't just fall with Maduro himself. It falls with the regime, it falls with their allies, it falls with anybody who's supporting and empowering them against the will of the Venezuelan people. I do think that having a strong combination of carrots and sticks, leverage that we could potentially deploy in a negotiation is critically important. And this is why we're going to continue with our sanctions policies. We're very fortunate in the United States that even, this is one of the few countries, or one of the few issues, that has bipartisan support. True bipartisan support. We saw bipartisan statements from members of Congress over this weekend about this electoral fraud. And that has continued to be maintained. And I know that will be the case going forward. So, to have a united American populace, to have a united Venezuelan populace, a united international populace, these are all things that are critically important as we continue the fight.
Yeah, thank you, Carrie. Jose Ignacio, let me put you a little bit on the spot here, because we haven't mentioned the word negotiation on this event yet. And I you're sitting in probably one of the most prestigious negotiation hubs in the world, in the Harvard. There's a lot of Harvard professors working on this issue, and I read all of their books, and I think it's very interesting, this area of conflict resolution. So I want to ask you, and just to put it in context, obviously negotiation has always so far being used by the Maduro regime to buy time, stay in power, divide opposition, and frustrate the Venezuelan people, right? And we have used negotiation attempts over 12 times since Chavez came in power, and now Maduro is in power. We have used negotiation with them in different attempts. So it's a very frustrating, it's a toxic war in many ways when it comes to Venezuela. But I want to ask you, now that we have this issue of January 5th, we have potentially a new National Assembly on the ground supported by the Maduro regime. We're going to have a new U.S. administration coming in soon after that. And the situation on the ground will continue to deteriorate at a very fast speed with the COVID-19 pandemic and all of the impact that entails. So do you see, let me just ask you, what a successful negotiation will look like for you in Venezuela, if any, in 2021? And let's start with you, and I want to hear our other guest speakers as well.
Wow, that's a big question. The fraudulent election of the National Assembly could be turned into an opportunity to boost negotiations. I do not really think that Maduro's consolidated his power with yesterday fraud. On the contrary, I think that Maduro has now more problems than ever. And this is why I think that under a proper negotiation strategy, it is possible to transform the fraudulent elections into an opportunity to advance in a successful negotiation. And the very first step for this successful negotiation, and this will be, I will say, the main goal for 2021, is to use the support of the international community for the recognition between Maduro and the opposition and the commitment to work in an actively negotiation process. You said very well, Moises, that Maduro has used negotiations to buy power, but not recently. If we analyze the last examples, in Norway, and particularly in the failed attempt to defer the parliamentary election, the main problem is that Maduro is not willing to sit down in a fair negotiation. So I will say that the very first objective should be to be able to sit down again the legitimate National Assembly and the Venezuelan opposition and the Maduro's government to advance in a negotiated settlement that, of course, preserve the human rights investigations regarding the atrocities committed by Nicolás Maduro. And starting from this, it is possible to work on incentives to increase the cost of repression of Nicolás Maduro and decrease any negotiated solution using the famous Ronald Dahl strategy towards a democratization process.
Thank you. Michael, look, this is also a tricky issue. Now I want to hear from Carrie too, but what type of conditions do you think there should be there to start, if any, a successful negotiation attempt, and how that roadmap should look like on your point of view?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's a tough one really for a Canadian to answer, because it's for Venezuelans, you know, and this isn't about a passing of the buck. And, you know, it's really, I think it's a really important point. Look, we were quite skeptical when negotiations began under, you know, the guidance of Norway, because we had seen the track record. That said, we think a country like Norway has an excellent role to play in this and can play it. So I would say, and again, I really caveat it because I don't think it's a place for Canada to say these are the conditions for negotiations. It's for Venezuelans to determine. But I think clearly there needs to be it gets back to Jose Ignacio's key word, distrust. There has to be a process where, you know, the relevant actors can say, well, we trust it. And I think that is absolutely critical. This is a very difficult one, and clearly we wouldn't be here if we had solved this already. There is likely to be some very quiet work taking place between the various political actors. Carrie's point earlier about, you know, it's the cracks in the regime that are probably more telling of where we're going. I think that's absolutely right. So I think there needs to be a solidarity from the international community on what we see as legitimate and illegitimate, solidarity from the international community on pressure when it comes to those acts that that require that type of a response, and really putting you know, our support behind those political actors to determine what they need for conditions and what is that trustful kind of situation needed. I know it doesn't answer your question, but again, I think it's difficult for us to do so.
Carrie, same question, also with the caveat of the democratic transition framework that the State Department released a few months ago. I consider that framework a good roadmap to get there, but with now these events happening yesterday on January 5th and the change of administrations later on, is that how that framework will be impacted, and also on the question of negotiation?
Sure. No, it's a good question. I mean, that framework is one of a number of possible roadmaps. I think it's a valuable one because what it did for the first time is really articulate, first and foremost, when and how U.S. sanctions would be lifted, which was of importance to the Maduro regime to understand what they would be getting in a negotiation. It was also important because I think it really highlighted what the subject of some of the conversations as part of this Oslo process really were, and really demonstrated that all that's being asked for by the Venezuelan opposition is sort of a return back to normal, meaning a return back to democracy. They're not asking to install anybody. They're not asking for benefits of any kind. They're just simply saying, hey, you remember this constitution that used to govern how we operate? Maybe we should go back to that. And so the fact that they need to make any kind of sacrifice in order to do that is a little bit against the sort of founding ethos of the Venezuelan constitution. But what I will say is when it comes to a negotiation, there are a couple things that I think could help it be more successful, whether it's along the lines of the framework or whether it's kind of a new structure. Part of it is making sure, as Jose Ignacio mentioned, that there is a way in which we can get the Maduro regime to negotiate in good faith. So that includes a couple of different kind of subcategories. The first one is there needs to be strong internal pressure inside Venezuela. As important as the international community is, I don't think that Maduro would decide to come to the table to negotiate his own exit if he didn't feel that pressure coming from within his own system. So that's really important. And I know that's something that the interim government has been highlighting over the last few months as well. The second is, as Michael mentioned, the importance of international unity. Only with the full international community coming together and highlighting what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable will the Maduro regime understand that there actually could be consequences if it chooses not to engage in a good faith negotiation. The third is to make sure that we have some kind of leverage, right? It could be sanctions, it could be other things. Sanctions has obviously been the preferred choice by the United States, but there's a number of different tools that we can use to try to encourage the Maduro regime to come to the table, whether it's carrots or whether it's sticks. And then there's also, of course, the word I keep using today, which is accountability. I think there needs to be some way of establishing accountability for the Maduro regime's actions, or else they're just going to continue to undermine human rights and undermine democracy in the country. I also think the negotiations would need to be structured appropriately. And what I mean by this is we saw how in the previous negotiation process, the only person who really had a say was Nicolas Maduro. And oftentimes those who were close to him were not aware of what was being put on the table. I think there needs to be more parties involved here. I think there needs to be a presence of the Venezuelan military. I think there needs to be a presence of some Chavistas who aren't specifically affiliated with the regime. It's possible there will need to be some international partners too, depending on what the carrots and the sticks are. So again, I think there's a lot of different ways that it could be structured to be potentially more effective and to demonstrate that that there really needs to be a solution here. I think it's important we continue what we're doing, but some of these modifications may help the process be a little bit more successful than those tried in the past.
Moises, can I add one point?
Oh, yes.
And that is, I think one thing that we can do is continue to demonstrate that we will support, we will backstop, a negotiated agreement. I think that's something that we can do. At the same time, we can also outreach to those countries that have showed support for the Maduro regime. I think there is nothing bad that will come from more dialogue, and I think it's something we have all shown a willingness to do.
Thank you, Michael. As we wrap up this event, I'm reading all the questions I'm getting, and I don't want to finish the event until I ask a couple of quick questions for our friends from Canada and the US. And one of them says, the new National Assembly will not be recognized by democratic countries like the US and Canada, but what about other actors like Russia and China? Will this new National Assembly enable the regime to strengthen its financial ties with other foreign acts? And the other question is there any in the foreseeable future, any new sanctions coming in regarding the rigged elections that just happened yesterday? And again, we have a minute and a half, but any quick reactions on that before we wrap up?
Well, just quick, I'm not sure how the ties can get tighter than they are now, but it is something that we are concerned about, of how others will view the National Assembly. So that is something, and I think we just have to make ourselves very clear on that. And on sanctions, definitely under consideration, and I would expect a number of countries to be rolling them out soon. Thanks.
And I would just add to that, obviously the United States is going to continue our pressure, continue our sanctions. I think there's a lot of individuals, if you look at the fact-finding mission and who they've identified as accountable. If you look at some of the egregious violations of human rights that we've seen, of democracy that we've seen over the last couple of days, we will absolutely look at those and continue to pursue things that we think would be helpful to, towards our policy goal. China, Russia, Iran, I'm certain that since they've continued to not respect the Venezuelan constitution, in the past, that they'll keep on that track. I mean, I don't see necessarily that changing, but what I have seen changing is, of course, the type of support that they're providing to the Maduro regime, in particular, China and Russia, who have started to backtrack a little bit. Obviously, part of the Maduro regime's game is to try to get this new National Assembly, this fraudulent National Assembly, to pass things like the anti-blockade law, things which are really sort of, in the best of terms, extra constitutional. What that really means is unconstitutional, to try to give them the ability to circumvent U.S. sanctions and other things. But it like all of the other Maduro regime's attempt is not going to manipulate the international community. As we've seen, major democracies around the world have highlighted the fact that this is a fraud, and will continue to do that going forward.
Carrie and Michael and Jose Ignacio, I want to thank you, each of you, for, again, taking the time to join us today. This was a fascinating event. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but I just want to reiterate, CSIS Future Venezuela Initiative is always going to be here for analysis, independent, objective analysis on this complex crisis. And we welcome all of you who are watching to keep track of our commentaries and events that are coming up early next year. But thank you, Carrie. Thank you, Michael, again, and Jose Ignacio for joining us. It was great to see you all.
Thank you, Moises. Always
Thank
a pleasure.
you so much.
Good to see you, Carrie, Jose Ignacio. Bye-bye.
Ciao.
Thank you so much.